you so much. I am very grateful to Paul Vishnu and Evi for inviting me here and for giving this. I'm going to give you a lecture. So, but I was. Can you hear me without the microphone? Yes. Because I was at a conference in Italy some years ago, and when I'm Italian, but I work in Paris as a professor. So when they gave me the microphone, they said, no, she doesn't need it because she speaks too loud. But so I'm gonna start with something that you have already seen. So you're supposed to have already seen the first part of the lecture, which is taken from Woolbridge, and it's some brush up of the method of differences in differences, so that it is sure that you will be completely mastering the method, and then I will go. So the first part, I'm going to brush up the method, and then I'm going to show you some examples of applications that I have taken from colleagues in top universities in the US. Okay? And so the first example which we're going to see is about the garbage incinerator. So does having a new garbage incinerator in your neighborhood, does it make that your house, if you are owning your house, does it mean that the value of your house is it going to go down? And we're going to check how do we test for that. And in theory, you should have already seen that. Then the new example is about the banking crisis and the fact that during bank crisis, often the federal bank. So are you still happy with me? If you don't hear, you just.
Is it okay using microphone or without microphone? Because we are also recording your.
Oh, okay. So I don't know. Well, I will try with microphone, but there is an echo in the microphone. Okay. So anyway, the other example we're going to see is about Federal Reserve Bank in the U.S. So the central bank. The central banks, when there are problems, the central banks, they always want to do some contractionary policies. So we're going to look at a quasi-natural experiment in which there was a big bank crisis, so all the banks had to close down. And we have in the same state in the United States, one bank wanted to help and do expansionary policies, a lot of liquidity to the banks to prevent them from having to close. And the other bank wanted to take a more conservative monetary policy, which is what probably economic textbook would suggest, and not actually even contract even more, before fear that, that you have to be more contractionary, more careful with not do expansionary policy when there is a recession already going on. So we're going to look at this with an example, and that's another application of differences in differences methods, which should be of interest also to people that do not do applied macro, but may be more interested in macroeconomics and banking. And finally, I'm going to show you the dissertation of a master's student of mine, which is probably very much like the type of dissertation that you're going to do. And she applied differences in differences dissertation to a dissertation. And she's going to look into some very special topics, so I will leave it for the surprise at the end. Okay, and next time it will be the same. So next Monday I will also give you the lecture, and I will also give examples and case studies with the application of methods that you can also use for your own dissertation. So if you have questions, you can either lift a hand or yes. Okay. So let's start for the first. So the first example is the one that you should have already seen if you have looked at how to use differences in differences with Woolbridge. So in this one, there is the decision. So it's an old data set, 1981. In 1981, it was decided to build an incinerator, and already in 1978, there were rumors that this incinerator would be built. And so we are going to see if having an incinerator, a house near the incinerator, is gonna put down the value of the house. So the hypothesis is that we want to test is whether if you live near the incinerator, your house is gonna have a lower value, which is actually interesting. Also, if you are in the rental market, because presumably also you can rent apartments cheaper or houses cheaper if they're near the incinerator, because the incinerator will make also the rent cheaper in the rental market for housing. So we're going to create, so if you are a student, you want to do this for your dissertation, you're going to create a dummy variable. So you're going to construct a variable which is equal to 1 if the house is near the incinerator and to 0 otherwise. Then you say, oh, but what is near the incinerator in my data, you know? So you have to take a decision. What is near the incinerator? So in this case, it's decided that the near the incinerator is if you are within 3 kilometers from the incinerator. Then, if you want to do a good dissertation, you will have to also make some robustness checks. So you're going to say, what happens if I look at prices of houses within 10 kilometers of the incinerator, within 20 kilometers, within 50, and see whether this effect is still there or not. So you're going to be very naive. So at first is your first regression, which I'm sure is not your case, but is your first regression model. You're just going to run a regression in which you're going to put the housing prices as the variable you want to explain, and then you're going to look at whether the fact of being near the incinerator has any effect. So you're taking the 1981 data, and you're going to run this estimation, and you're going to find a very, very significant effect. You know, your t is 5. Normally a t to be significant, the t of student is enough 2, but here it's 5, so it's really a very strong effect and very negative. So the incinerator has put down the value of the house. But be careful what is happening there. We are looking at 1981. So this is not a causal effect. The incinerator was already built. So we don't know if it is really that the incinerator has put the value of the house down, or maybe the local city council, when they decided where to put the rubbish incinerator, they chose an area where no one is going to complain, because maybe there are only poor households there, or maybe it's an area where there are already very, very few houses there, so it's cheaper for them to buy land. And to use the land, even if they already own it, it's cheaper for them to put the incinerator there because the house prices there were already low. So here, since 1981 is already with the incinerator, the 1981 price, they're just correlating negatively for houses close to the incinerator with the fact that there is an incinerator. This is not a causality. So if you do this regression, and you tell your supervisor, oh, the incinerator has reduced the value of the houses near the incinerator, you are not going to get a very good grade, because they say, no, this is not a causality effect, this is just a correlation. You have to look at what were the housing prices before, and you have to compare. So to do this properly, we're going to take the next slide. So we're going to look at what happened before the incinerator is built. So you take 1979 data, and you run the same regression, and again, you're going to find a negative effect. So this is actually confirming the fact that the incinerator was built in a place where the housing prices were already low, because the incinerator was not there yet in 1978, and we still find a significantly negative effect. So being near the incinerator makes $20,000, $18,000 less of value for square meters for your house. So, okay, now what do? This negative price was there, this negative effect is there after the incinerator and also before the incinerator. So how do we look at the question we wanted to answer, which is, did the incinerator put the house price down? How do we examine that? We have to compare these two coefficients. So here it's minus $18,824, and before, after the incinerator is put there, is minus $30,000. So what we have to do is compare minus $30,688 each square meters value, minus $30,000 less after the incinerator is built, but before the incinerator it was already minus 18,000. So we have to do the difference between 30,000 and 18,000, and that's the additional negative value to the housing prices of having the incinerator. So here, what we're going to do, we're going to apply the differences in differences method. So this method, differences in differences, is only requiring that we are comparing the prices of the houses before the incinerator was built, minus $18,800 per square meters minus, with what happens after it is built, minus $13,688. And so comparing before and after, so what is the effect we want to look at is the fact of having an incinerator there. And we're going to look at data before and after the incinerator is built, and we're going to compare two groups. So which are the two groups? Houses near the incinerator, within 3 kilometers, and houses farther from the incinerator, okay? And so we are having these two groups. So the difference in difference estimators is called difference in difference because it's the difference between the houses closer relative to those far away, and this difference is taken twice. That's why it's difference in difference, before and after the construction of the incinerator. Okay, so this is the way to see difference in difference estimator. What is the way to do this? You have the average price of houses near the incinerator and the average price of houses farther from the incinerator, and you're going to compare these two values before and after. So this is after the difference in 1981, after the incinerator was put there, and the difference in 1979, before the incinerator was put there. So this is called difference in difference estimator. So this is at least the second time you see these slides. So I think you should now know this perfectly. And this is what looks if we run the regression. So if we put all these things together in the regression, we're going to have a dummy for being near the incinerator, near ink. Then we're going to have a dummy for the year 1981, and the reference for that dummy is 1979. So we only have 2 years of data, 1979 and 1978 and 1981. And then we have the interaction, 1981 times the near ink dummy. So those first two variables, near ink and Y81, you just interact them, and that is our differences in difference estimators. So now we know that the incinerator lowers the housing prices by $11,000 per square meter. Okay, so if your house is like 1,000 square meters, is a big villa, that this effect is very, very large. Okay, and if you wanna know more about the incinerator, this is, this is just an example of a policy. So it could be the incinerator, but often there are other policy changes, you know. So there are so many new policies that are introduced every time, and you can easily apply these things. So here we're going to apply now to the case of the bank and the bank crisis. But another example is that you could look at other policy changes. So for example, you could look at tax reforms, and you could look at the effects of some income tax reforms on the hours worked by people if you have data before and after the tax reform for your outcome of interest, which is the hours. So very often, when I talk to my students about their dissertation, what I say is that try to find a topic that interests you, first of all. Then, in that topic, look at what are the data available. And then look at what the others have done. So you don't have to look at all the literature for everything possible, but just first choose the topic, then see what data are available and see what other people have done. And very often you can do, maybe you find that for that data, for that period, there was maybe some reform the person had not looked at yet, or maybe that policy reform has already been looked at, but they looked at the price of the effect of the incinerator on the housing prices. Maybe you can look at a different variable, whether the incinerator being there affected something else. So I don't know whether you're going to look at some other variables. Maybe there are more businesses that are going to open near the incinerator because now the price is lower. So normally, even if there are lots of researchers, they have not looked at everything already. So you can quite easily find a new topic for your dissertation, but you have to proceed in steps. So to just look at what the others have done, what data you have, and what is your possible variation to get some interesting questions. Is it the policy reform? There can be many other things. Like here we're going to look now at recessions. And so let's look at, if you don't have comments, I'm going to show you the new case study, which is about this bank. So this is a long time ago. I was not born yet either, even if I'm older than you. So this was in the 1930s. It is a very, very famous recession because it was like, it's the most famous of the history because it was, you know, a long time ago, and there were so many banks that closed down and people that lost their job. So this is a photo of unemployed people at the time in the United States, and it's called the Great Depression. And so the paper we're going to look at has been published in a very nice economic journal called the Journal of Political Economy, and is going to exploit a quasi-experimental identification strategy to look at the effect of this recession and on policies. So the first thing you have to know is that there was this Caldwell Bank, which was the most important bank at the time in this in the southern of the United States. And when this recession started in 1930, there was a big stock market crash at the end of 29. And then all these banks that were owned by this Caldwell, they started to close down. And then many, many banks failed, up to 4,000 banks. Can you imagine? 4,000 banks closed down. So it was a very, very big, major disaster, a major crisis. So this is, to understand this paper, we have to know a little bit about the banking. So how do banks work? You know, banks are lending money to consumers, are lending money to businesses, and there is this relation of trust. So normally, I guess all of you have a bank account, a credit card, and I don't know whether you have to worry what happens if this bank is going to close down. Am I going to lose all of the money? Normally, we don't worry about these things. But at that time, people started to see that all the banks were closing down. So all of a sudden, what they do, they all run to get their money back. Because this relationship of confidence and trust, all of a sudden, you don't trust your bank anymore. Is my bank going to close as well, like the other ones? Are they going? So everyone was taking the money out of the banks. So normally, it is not a problem, but at that time, everyone was taking out the money, so there was a big rush to take money out of the banks. So the whole banking system broke down. So in the 1930s, this was a very, very big crisis, and there was a big panic. So many banks failed, and many people lost money. And something similar happened in a more recent recession in 2008, 2010, but at that time, it was not as severe as here. Even if also many people lost their money, banks didn't have to close down. So what happened is you have to look at these things that it started in 1929, and by the time in 1929, back in time, on the first day, 3 banks closed in the state of Mississippi, and then the day after, 29 banks closed, and then there was such a panic that by 3 years later, 4,000 banks had closed. So it was a major, major disaster for the banking system. And so what we're going to exploit here in this paper, what they exploit for the identification, is that the United States is very big, and there are lots of central banks. So in Italy, in France, in Indonesia, I think you only have one central bank, is that right? In the US, they have one big central bank, but then they also have lots of regional central banks. So what we're going to exploit here is that there is a state of Mississippi where there were all these Caldwell banks and many more banks, which actually has 2 central banks. Because these 2 central banks are located at the border between different districts, different regions. So there is the Atlanta Fed. So in the state of Mississippi, you have 2 banks, the Atlanta Fed and also the St. Louis Fed. So the fact is that what is critical here for the identification is that one of the 2 banks was very conservative. So this Atlanta Fed was very open-minded. So the Atlanta Fed wanted to lend the money to the banks in trouble, you know, what normally you wouldn't want to do because these banks are all failing, so we're not going to give them more money, it's going to be dangerous. But the Atlanta Fed was very open-minded and progressively oriented and thought we have to do something because the consumers, the companies are going to be hit because the banks are failing. So we have to give more money to these banks. So the Atlanta Fed gave more money. But the other bank, the St. Louis Fed, was looking at this more traditional and normal philosophy in economics, which is they're going to fail, we are not going to give them money, we're actually going to restrict the credit we're going to give. Maybe we even put interest rates farther up, you know. So what happened is that we can exploit this for identification. So because the border between these 2 federal bank areas of action goes through the state of Mississippi, and so actually the other important thing is that this border and this position of these 2 Fed is not related to the crisis. So they were there already in 1913, since 1913, well before, because of course you cannot be satisfied enough with saying, I find this really crazy, quasi-experimental. You always have to think that people will object something. Yeah, but these Fed were put there because of the crisis, so it's all endogenous. Oh no, it's all endogenous, I have to find another research project. No, luckily they were there since 1913, so you can go ahead with your plan. Okay, so they were there before. So there was also some difference in the outcomes. So where was the Atlanta Fed? The Atlanta Fed increased lending by 40%, while in the bank lending by St. Louis dropped by 10%. So the policies are really very, very different. One increased lending by 40%, and the other one lends 10% less than they would usually do. Okay. Then what they do in this paper, we're going to do a differences in differences method. So the treated bank, we have to decide which are the treated banks and which are the control group. And we're going to exploit these 2 Feds for the treatment. So first of all, we can compare the number of banks that were operating 18 months after the crisis, and you're going to see that there were 132 banks. So it's a bit like the incinerator. We're going to compare these banks' numbers after the crisis already started. You're going to see that in Atlanta, so what is there were 120 banks. No, in Atlanta there were 132 banks, and in the others, wait. So what is the 8th district? What is the 6th district? I don't recall this. Okay, so the the 8th district is the restrictive policy, so it's the same risk, and the 6th district is the expansionary policy. Okay, so in the restrictive banking, the area there were 132 banks, and then the other area which was doing the expansionary policy, there were 121 banks. So if we're going to compare these figures, we find fewer banks under the expansionary policy. But of course this is tricky, this is not what you should do. You should compare to before and after. So you should look at this difference before and after. So if we look at this difference before and after, you actually we find that there were more banks that survived the crisis in the expansionary area rather than the contractionary bank area. So let's look at these figures here. So we're going to adjust for the differences in differences, and we're going to compute the differences in differences. So we're going to compare the banks before and after the recession in these two different areas. And we're going to take one of the two areas, the restricted one, as the control group, and the treatment group, the expansionary FED. So using the standard regression for diff in diff, we're going to compare banks in the 6th district before the crisis to after the crisis, and banks in the 8th district before and after the crisis. And then here you find that there were 19 more banks in the district which had the FED, which was doing the expansionary policy, so the Atlanta district. So according to this paper message, the bank that decided to give more liquidity to banks that were already failing actually did the best, because they had more banks surviving. But to know that, you have to compare before and after across these two banks allocated into these two different areas with different FED. Okay, so you can also write it the same equation, so you see you can turn around, so you can make the difference between the number of banks in the 6th district after minus before, minus the difference in the number of banks in the 8th districts after minus before, so the two differences across, or you can do this the other way around, so you can take the difference between the 6th and the 8th in the year of the treatment, and the 6th in the 8th in the year before the treatment. And so this is, in French, we also call it double difference, because you take the difference twice. Whichever of the two you do, you get the same result, which is 19 banks. And then here you don't have the standard error. So do we know if this is significant or not? We're not happy yet. So we're actually going to run a regression, and we're going to see that is statistically significant. And actually, we're also going to look at the pre-trends. So here, we're going to look at, we put this in a graph, and you're going to see that the number of banks is dropping over time in both districts, but you know that the slope of this dropping line is smaller for the 6th district. So you can also draw a counterfactual, which would be if the 6th district had the same slope as the 8th district, that would be even steeper. And the difference between the two slopes is also giving you the difference in difference estimate. But again, this is a descriptive illustration. So what we want to do is that we're gonna also look at the regression design. And so what we do, first of all, is also looking at the common trends. So if we want to run the regression, we also have to establish that the banks in these two different districts behave the same before the crisis. So we're going to look at the common trends assumption, and so we're going to take data back in time, and we're going to see that more or less the common trend assumption is validated. So we're going to show the number of banks in operation,
And here we're actually using this pre-trans behavior to also extrapolate what would happen after the crisis if the 6th district had behaved like the 8th. Okay, so normally if you do common trends, you can also just stop at the year where the crisis is starting. So you can see this common trends is not really perfect. So if you were not, so this paper was published in one of the best journals of economics. Now if it's the authors, maybe it was one of us, maybe we would not manage, because I think the common trends for me doesn't look completely persuasive. But it's still a super interesting paper with a very nice research idea, and they can show that even if this maybe common thread is not super perfect, you can control for a lot of characteristics also your regressions. But normally it's nicer to have nicer behaved common trends. So, and I will show you that my dissertation student, master student, did nicer common trends than they had there. Okay, so here you have this evidence on this, what is the fact that the bank failure were moving in parallel before the crisis, and then the banks are declining more in the district which had this conservative monetary policy relative to the other district. So this experiment, this quasi-experiment is going to show to you that actually doing a more conservative monetary policy can be counterproductive. And when you're going to look at the extrapolation again from these figures, you can see what is happening here. So the dashed line is the counterfactual evolution of the number of banks in the 6th district if the same number of banks had failed in that district after 1930 as did in the 8th. So if also the 6th district had applied a contractionary policy, this what would happen is this dashed line. You would have a lots more bank failure also in the 6th district. So these findings in the paper are really very powerful, and also the authors illustrate them with a lot of graphs. And actually, they are extrapolating all these trends in the graphs. So they're going to show to us that these differences continue until 1934 and was counterfactual until 3 years after the crisis, because this crisis was very long lasting. So the relative fall-off in bank activity in the 8th district after the Caldwell collapse emerges clearly. These figures also document that the St. Louis Fed actually abandoned the tight money. So what happened is that the Fed, so this is also really interesting, because normally Federal Reserve Bank don't often change their mind, but in this case this crisis was so strong that the bank that was adopting the more conservative policy, seeing that the effect was actually counterproductive, and that the other closing nearby bank who was doing expansionary policy and giving liquidity to the banks failing, they had a better outcome because fewer banks were failing. So also the other bank started to follow a less conservative policy. And so in the end, the two regional federal banks both started to land. So the trends in the bank activity should converge again, but actually this did not happen. So the fact that at the beginning of the crisis there was this restrictionary policy made the crisis much worse, and 3 years later, even if the bank that had, let's say, taken the less good option, tried to change their behavior, it was a little bit too late, because already the disaster had happened. So that's also interesting for policy decisions. Okay, so in a way, right now, they only did all these graphs using just the descriptive data. They never showed us yet the standard errors, okay? So now we get finally to see the regression. So if you do a regression, maybe you know already that you will construct a dummy called treat for the shock that is your variable of interest. So this treat is the treatment. And then you have a dummy for post, because you want to look at the interaction of the treatment with the post after this policy change. So the interaction term of treat and post is going to give you the coefficient in the causal effect. Okay, so you're going to write this into an equation. So your outcome variable, so this one you can apply to your data, to different cases. Your outcome variable is going to be a function of the treatment dummy, and then you're going to look at the post after the policy. So here, treat is whether you are in the 6th district, and post is whether it is years after 1930. And then, when you estimate it in the data, we finally get the treatment effect, which you can see is 20.5. So from the descriptive data, only subtracting number of banks in the 2 districts before and after the crisis, we had 19, and from the regression estimates, we get 20.5. So it's very close to the 19, and the standard error is 10.7. So you can see that this is significant only at the 10% level. And actually, this is not surprising, because actually this is also a very small sample. There are only a few hundred banks in this sample. So if any of you or me, we try to replicate this study, probably we will not be able to publish on the same good journal as the others, because they will tell us, hey, but your sample is too small, the common trends hypothesis is not so well validated, and there are a number. But I think the research idea was so intelligent and so clever, because how, you see, normally if you try to test what is the effect of different types of monetary policy or effects of the recession, you need to have some exogenous variation, because everything is correlated and changed together. So here they have this very, very clever identification strategy. Okay, so with this method, you can make up for the fact that many things are endogenous in the data and in the when you look for things, for variables, questions that you want to explain, often many things are exogenous. But when you find some clever identification strategy, like they do in this paper, then this is going to be a good method. So even in the absence of random assignment, treatment and control groups are likely to differ for many reasons, however, and so you have to also check for the parallel trend assumption. So you have to show that those two, in this case, the banks in those 2 different districts were behaving similarly before this policy change. And we have seen that here it was not really completely persuading, but you will have to show that and hope that in our case it's more persuading. So the other thing is that you have to do a lot of robustness checks. So first of all, you can include other controls. So here in this case, which are the controls that one would want to include? Maybe other controls concerning either the regional differences, so some regional differences in other variables. It could be population, it could be number of maybe business activity sector, or if you have GDP, some indicator of GDP growth by region. If it was data concerning the banks, maybe we want to know something about how much money is that by these banks, you know, what was the total amount of money run by different banks, some maybe some information on the interest rates, I don't know. You have to be careful though that when we add these explanatory variables, they should not be endogenous. So that's a bit tricky, you know, because there are some things that you don't want to include in your regression because they can actually correlate with the outcome that you are trying to explain. So you have to be very careful with this. And another question here, if you want to know, here is that if you're looking at in this data, you probably have to cluster standard errors. Because this policy is at the district level and there are all these banks' data. So with only 2 years of data, and with so few observations, maybe this model is fine as it is. But if you had more years and more data, you may want to cluster the standard errors, maybe at the level of the bank, if you observe the bank many times. Depends, because the number of banks is your outcome variable. Okay, so I don't know if you have questions on this example. Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm Udi Puncoro from Linkage Bapenas. I want to ask about this different. As far as I know, it can be used to measure the impact of government policies. How about how to measure the control and treatment if all of the population get the treatment? For example, government in Indonesia give dana desa village fund for all of the village in Indonesia. So we can get the data for before and after, but I still don't understand how to get the control and treatment. And also, can we use in Indonesia? There are two the little unit in Indonesia is village, autonomous village and non-autonomous village. Can we use that as control and treatment? Because they are structurally different. Even though they are at the same level, but they are structurally different. Can we use that as control and treatment? That's my question.
Thank you so much for this question, because this is a very common problem that we try to design this policy evaluation, and you see the people are treated, but you don't see who is your control group. It happens all the time. Yes, all the observation receive the treatment, so it's very difficult to answer. Normally, you can look at, if you can find the groups, they should be affected by different extent, then you can have some kind of gradual effect. So for example, if you have different groups, so these two groups, I don't know, it depends if the pre-trends, the two types of villages that you mentioned, you have to check if in the pre-trends they are similar or not. Then it could be possible. But in some cases, it could be groups of the population with different income level, for example. An example were some retirement policies. So in Europe, we have a pension system, which depends on the age of people, and they did some reforms. So according to this reform, depending on which year you are born, you have to work longer and longer. Like imagine you were born in the 1960s, you have to work for 35 years. If you were born in a bit more young, in 1965, you have to work 38 years. If you were born in 1970, you have to work 1940 years. Maybe you're a generation, they will ask you to work 45 years, but this is not yet happened. 43 years right now is the maximum work to get this very good pension. And when they do the reform, imagine they do the reform and they say, as from 2025, from 2025, all the people born in 1970 have to work 1 more year, all those born in 1980 have to work 2 more years, all those born in 1990 have to work 3 more years. So you have that depending on the age, the intensity of this treatment is varying. Then even if you don't have a real control group, but the intensity of treatment varies, then you can interact at the post with each of the different subgroups, and you can still have an estimate of the effect. If everyone is treated in the same way, you'll have to hope that maybe the policy is designed, so you have to read very well the policy design and see. Maybe this policy design only applies to households with a certain level of income, so that you can compare those just before the level of income to those just above the level of income. Maybe people with richer are not able to receive some benefits. So you should not take so to be very careful that you should not take very rich people to compare them with very poor people, because it's not going to work. But you have to compare people that are just a little bit above that income threshold and those that are just below the income threshold. I don't know if I
So regarding with the village allocation funds, because all of the villages are getting the funds, so is it possible if we use like the value of village allocation fund and then divided by the number of people or the number of population in each village, and then we will get the village allocation fund per capita, and then we can interact with the post variable before and after, and then we can see how the village allocation fund works. Is it if we see during after the village allocation fund implements, is it a higher village allocation funds, and after the policy will reduce the percentage of the number of poor people in that village? Is it okay if we use this identify strategy to use as an indicator?
Okay, that's very interesting. So the allocation money is the same, irrelevant of the size of the village.
Each village they will get the different number of money.
Oh. But it does not depend on the population.
Yeah, it will be influenced by several factors.
Okay, so you have to include all the several factors that you can measure. Then I think you have to take the population before the policy. So like if this policy is implemented now, you have to look at the village population a few years before. You have to make sure that people don't move from one village to the other because of the, but otherwise this could be an option. Perhaps, could be an option. I'm only worried that the population will vary the amount of money that you get. But if you use the population, take the population out a couple of years before the policy was known, so that you're sure that it's not confounding the effect. And
It doesn't change much every year. Is it okay if you use that?
what is the outcome?
The outcome, for instance, the index of the development village, or maybe the percentage of number of poor people.
So the outcome are at the level of the village. Okay. Do you observe also the individual in the village?
You can work with other data as well in the individual level or also level.
Because sometimes if you observe the individual, it's easier to find some control group with the individual. For example, I will next show you the dissertation of the student of mine. She could not find, to find the control group, she decided that women will be affected more than men, so a control group is women versus men. But in some cases this distinction doesn't work, so yes. Yes. Yes, it's always a dilemma, yes. Okay, and if you agree with the village level, you have to cluster the standard error at the village level. That's another problem. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to show you, I think we will have time for this. So I'm going to show you a dissertation of a student of mine, which is on a topic which is called the Me Too topic. So maybe you heard about this Me Too movement. Okay, so she's called Candice and she did this dissertation last year. So what she's discussing is this Me Too movement. Me Too movement started on Twitter because some actress in the United States accused some of the producers of gender-based violence against her. And then all the people were using the Me Too to tweet whether they had experiences of gender-based violence. So what she's gonna use this Me Too as the treatment, because this movement started in October 2017, and she's gonna use data from a European survey, the European Social Survey, which is very similar to the World Value Survey, of which you have also for Indonesia. So you have Indonesia World Value Survey 2018, And she used European Social Survey 2017, and she's using the question that they asked all the respondents, are you scared when you walk at night in the street? And she's gonna see whether the policy, what is the treatment, so the fact that there was this big Me Too in all the news, is making women that answer the survey more scared to walk at night or less scared to walk at night. And it's unclear whether it should be more or less, but it's also going to look at the effects on trust. So whether the trust in the government and the trust in the police is changing due to the fact that there was this big Me Too movement. So the idea is to use social media event via Twitter. It can be, it doesn't have to be Me Too, it can be some other big event where everyone is interested about this happening. So it could be also your policy change at the village money, and see whether after the government has this new policy, the trust in the government has increased, the trust in the police is increased, and I think fear should not be affected by the policy, but it could also affect the fear if you have a policy at the village level. Okay, so what is she gonna do also? She's gonna take data from Google, so Google Trends data, and she's gonna look at the intensity of people that were putting Me Too tweets in the period in different European countries, so she can differentiate the treatment across different regions of Europe and between men and women. So she's gonna do triple differences in differences. So this is interesting, triple differences in differences, because you take the difference 3 times, before and after the Me Too, so before and after 2017, between men and women, and also across different regions of Europe. Okay, so this data is the European Social Survey. So actually, if you decide to do your thesis with European data, they can just be click and download. So I often give it to students, because the European Social Survey, you click on it and you download it on your computer, and this longitudinal panel, people are interviewed many times in different years. And the same is the World Value Survey, which also has Indonesia in 2018. And that's more for people that do applied micro. But then if you're a macroeconomist, they have questions on trusting the government, so that's also interesting for political economy and macroeconomists. So what she's gonna do with these variables is feeling of safety walking alone, and trust in the protective institutions, so trust in the government and trust in the police. Okay, so this is the index. Sorry, I went too fast. So this is the index she's taking from the intensity with Google across the different European countries. And actually, just to see that there is some variation. And then this is the equation she's going to estimate. So the first equation is the standard differences in differences. So now you should know how to write it. You have your outcome variable, y. Then you have the year after the policy dummy, post. Then you have a dummy for whether the person is a female. And then you interact post with female. So post will be 2018 times female. So these are only dummy variables. And you can take years before and after the policy. So, in the sake of time, then we also have controls. So here it's individual data, so she uses age, where people were living, the education, the parents' education, the income, whether you are employed, how many people are in your household, whether you are having a partner, you are married, whether you are a religious person, if you are a member of a trade union. And she also has controls for the different countries, the different years, and country times year, and even the month. Because in some months, some of these things can change, people go out more often in the summer. So, look at the parallel trends. So I think our parallel trends seem better than those in the bank paper, if I may, with all the respect with those very good authors. So this is only a student like you, but she's looking at the earlier year. So this is the variable people say whether they have some fear of walking alone out at night in your neighborhood, and these are the pre-trends. So you don't have to show the after, because the after is going to be contaminated by the policy. The change was in 2017, so she only takes the survey 2005, 2010, 2015. So she's 3 points before. The blue line are the men, and the red line are the women. So even if women are on average a bit more scared than men, you still have that the parallel trends look very much similar. And then she's going to estimate that regression for the trust is going to be triple differences. So to have the triple differences, she has this differentiation of the intensity at the country level that she took from the Google Trends data, whether the Me Too movement was very strong in each country, for which I showed that table. So did she interact in post with the strength of Me Too with whether you're a female? And that's the triple differences. So the beta 1 with all the three interactions is the treatment effect. Then the beta 2 and all these other are just that you have to have them there. So all these interactions and all the variables also alone. This is a triple difference. So you can do triple differences using this for any application you want to use. And then you put all these controls and the X. Okay, and these are the pre-trends for trust. So whether people trust the police by the level of Me Too intensity before the Me Too actually started to exist, so before 2017. And again, you see that the red line is the men and the blue line is women. And you see that they behave super similar, the pre-trends, for trusting the police. And then we have the same for trust in the legal system. So sorry, it was not the government, it was the legal system. So the trust in the legal system also has very similar pre-trends. Okay, so she had done very nice pre-trends, and then she did the estimation, and she found there was no significant effect. So she was very deceived. So this is when it looks significant, it's only because women are more scared than men. But when you interact with the post, women and fear, it's not significant. So women are more scared than men all the time, but it does not change after or before 2018. So she was very disappointed because she had everything so nice, and then the effect is not significant. But then she went and she looked at different age groups. So she said maybe it's different for younger women and older women, because maybe older women, they go out a bit less, so maybe they don't care, and maybe it's the young women that go out. So she chose the age 30, not because of special reason. The only reason she chose age 30 is that if she chooses age 20, there would be too few people in the data, so it would not make sense. So she had to choose age 30 to be young, but enough that there are enough people that are below age 30 in the survey. And so when she interacted with the age 30, then she finds a significant effect. And the significant effect is the important thing is the triple interaction, under 30 post and the woman. And she found that the younger women, after the Me Too movement started, are actually more scared to go out than before, because maybe there is now this awareness that going out is potentially dangerous. So maybe they get less confident than before, which is paradoxical, because this was a feminist movement, Me Too, so it should empower women, should not make them more scared. So then she found this effect with a positive coefficient, so increasing fear due to this movement. So here is, I think I don't want to be exceeding, because I know that you have a super busy schedule, and I think I am worried, okay. I have time, yes, okay, I have plenty of time. Okay, so she found that there is no significant overall effect, but the effect is significant for the younger women under 30. And then if she looks at the increase in the trust in the legal system and trust in the police, nothing is significant for no one. So these effects are not significant for trust in the police and trust in the legal effects. Except for women, again, under 30 years old, but this causal effect that she finds, when she starts to do robustness checks, it becomes not significant. So it's a very, it's not really a solid effect. Okay. And then she compares also people that live in the city, so urban individuals. So people are living in the city versus people that live in rural areas. And when she compares living in the city versus living in rural areas, there is increased trust in the police and the legal system in countries with high intensity movements for people that live in the city, which also makes sense, because if you live in the city, you are more likely to go out, maybe also walking, than if you live in a rural area. And however, she found this difference. So this issue is that she's doing these tribal differences. So the low intensity countries, so she has difference across different types of countries. Countries with a strong intensity of this treatment and countries with a low intensity, because people do not use the Twitter a lot. So in those countries with low intensity, she finds that there is a decrease in trust in protective institutions, while in countries with high intensity, there is an increase in trust in the political institution. But I don't know whether you can see that this invalidates the estimation approach in a way, because you have this progressive treatment. You don't really have a clear control group, because everyone was exposed to B2 everywhere in the world. So she tries to look at different intensity of using the tweets to try and have this variation in the intensity of the treatment. But then below the low intensity and high intensity treatment, they have it going in opposite direction. So this is not really good, because you should have a progressive effect and not effects in opposite direction. So it's overall, it's very good for a dissertation, and what is very important is that you are very honest, that you don't try to cheat. So she's been reporting everything, even when it's not significant, even when it invalidates the idea. So actually this triple difference is unclear whether it's a really good idea, because it doesn't really seem to, there are some weaknesses with the fact that they don't really increase in the effects, but you find the opposite effects for low intensity and high intensity. So actually you can't even really estimate the triple difference together. So what are the conclusions? First of all, there are some limitations. So one limitation is that she only looked at year 2018, because later years were not available, and the effects may take some time to take place. Then she has a finding that her data is not very precise, so especially this data she uses on the intensity of the Me Too via Google trends does not look perhaps perfect. Then she was looking at effects on feelings, and actually feelings are a subjective variable. So in some countries, people may have a tendency to always answer yes to everything they get asked, and maybe give more intensity. Like if you ask, I'm Italian, so you see I'm moving my hands when I'm talking, and maybe I will say that I'm very scared, and maybe if I come from, now I don't know Asian countries differences so much, but if I come from Scandinavian countries, maybe people are more reserved, so I will say, I'm a little scared, even if I'm really very scared, you know? And so you can see these differences in answering subjective feelings. The same may apply for the police, you know? And there may be national studies, national countries in which people have more trust in the police, in the legal system, everyone. So she's comparing across countries, and she has the country dummies. But even if she has country dummies, there may be really bigger differences in how people answer these questions that she cannot control for. They're very subjective questions. The other thing when you use this subjective survey is that people may actually feel obliged to answer. So like if you ask a person, do you have trust in the government, or do you have trust in the legal system? they may feel obliged to say, yes, I have trust. And this kind of social obligation and social norms may vary from one country to the other. So again, when you compare across countries, you may get wrong conclusions, because you have to take into account that there are cultural differences, that to this subjective question, people may have different attitudes to answer yes or no, and to feel that they have to also answer what they're expected to answer from the person that asked the survey. So it's a bit tricky. So there you cannot do much. You can only do by try to compare different questions, try to compare different questions, control for the country fixed effects, so for the country dummies, and then maybe try to do more in-depth descriptive analysis of these countries to try and get some feelings for whether they're different. So don't only immediately estimate the differences in differences model. First, do some sample descriptive analysis. It's very important. Remember, even if you are the best econometrician in the world, always do some descriptive data. Yes, because I never forget some of my students, very best students, that come with these regression results and they're very strange, and then I say, but did you do the descriptives? And maybe there was very few people that answer certain questions. So you also have to care about non-response. When you look at your data, or the countries for which you don't have the data, if you're doing cross-country comparisons, for some countries you don't have the information, maybe it's important to also know why such variables are not available, and so forth. Okay, so these are the limitations, but there are the conclusions. I don't know if I put the conclusion slide. I seem to be blocked. It's the last slide. Okay, so the conclusions is coming from you, maybe, if you have a question.
Yes, any questions? This is very interesting topic, yeah? Very relevant with our classes. Any questions? I hope you have some questions.
I can ask you questions. So, as someone of you planning to use differences in differences for your dissertation, you can raise your hands. If you are planning to use differences in differences, I will not ask more questions. You just can raise your hands. I'll be contented with that. No one planning to use differences in differences. What about the impact evaluation? OLS, only OLS. But then you have to be careful, everything is going to be endogenous, so how are you going to deal with that? How are you going to deal with the distinction from whether the prices were already low before this incinerator? You can compare, so you will have to do, how are you going to do that? Okay, so let's see. So are you planning to do randomized control trials? RCTs? No. Yes. It takes time. So, okay. So what are you planning to do? Basic regressions. With macro data or micro data? Who is going to use the survey data? Micro data.
Raise your hand.
Okay, some people. Who is going to use macro data, time series? Time series data. Who is not using any data? Who is not using any data? We're using, can you look at Google Trends data? Can you use Google Trends data here? Okay. Because sometimes with Google Trends data, it's super interesting. You can see who is searching for certain. We look as an example with some students. We look at restaurant address, and we find 14th of February, Valentine's Day. Everyone is looking, so everyone is looking for a restaurant address. Then we find, you know, a heat wave. No one is looking for restaurant address. Everyone is at home to recover from the heat. Yes. So you can also create some data. Who is gonna collect their own data? No. Can you do review of the literature for your dissertation? Review of the literature. Who is doing a review of the literature? It's too early. Who does not know what to do yet? Okay, so you don't know what to do.
Maybe related to my previous question. Recently, before I came to this class, I get an econometric class, and it's about fixed effect. Because it's really difficult for me to distinguish between the control and treatment group using village 1. Can I use the fixed effect for measuring the impact of the village 1 to the maybe poverty level or village development? Can I use fixed effect? Yeah.
Yes, funnel data model. Yes, of course. Yes, sounds good. Funnel data model. Yes. 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 Yes, this sounds very good. Yes, because with some fixed effects you can get around with some unobservable and selection effects. But yes. Okay. Thank you so much. Yes.
Probably my question might be silly because I'm not from economics. In your examples, like there's a thing like a crisis and the bank is deteriorating. It's like the after is less. What happens if there's a event where it's less, but it's not because of deteriorating, but it's like merger? How do we treat that? Can we use that as well?
Very good question. Yes, yes. So you could have your outcome variable, number of mergers, or you have to do robustness checks. You have to drop from your analysis data banks that have merged. So this is a very, very good point. Now, in the case of this data set that we saw, they have so few banks that I'm not sure that I would encourage them to drop those that are mergers, but they can try. So you have to do some robustness checks. Either you have the outcome, how many mergers, instead of how many bank number. You can look at bank mergers, so how many bank merged, or a dummy, was there a merger or not. But then it's a possibility, but probably the easiest possibility is just to check what happens if you take away from the data any banks that merged. So you have to take them away from the before and the after data set and see if your results are still robust. So you can also do both things. I think the merger is very interesting because nowadays, so actually another point which is very relevant to this question is that we cannot, from what we saw, so what is very important is that nowadays, maybe we would observe more merger when there is a problem, because someone will come in and buy the bank that has a problem. So it's a very, very nice point. And also, we cannot use that experiment to say that the banks have to give liquidity to banks that are failing, because that applies to the 1930. So the issue, which is maybe external validity, this experiment of the 1930s, we cannot extrapolate it to nowadays. The banking system is so different. And this question brings it up, which is that, nowadays you would not let the bank fail. First of all, there would be insurance companies that would come into play. Then I think it's not clear the FED should have to rescue these banks. They have no choice, I guess, like what happens in a recession. but then you have all this selling of the credits and selling. But that actually was the 2008 recession, because in the United States, in the 2008 recession, what happened was that people started to worry and they started to sell their debt and resell it, and that was making even a more mess than the Fed. Are you aware of that? Yes. So in any case, the important thing is also that sometimes you cannot use, like even if you evaluate the impact of a policy, you cannot generalize it. You cannot say this is the message for everywhere on the context. You may have to say this is what I find for this policy affecting this context. And maybe even within the same country, even within Indonesia, if we look at a different policy, maybe the message would be different because maybe it's designed in a different way. Yes. And so I hope that you get dissertation ideas. So as I said, try to look at the topic that you like most from your classes. Some example is also to just take a paper which is not too difficult, which exists, and replicate it by looking at the different outcome variable. And like now, if you want to be very ambitious, if you take many journals in economics, but like American Economic Review, if they are published, the authors have to put all the do files, all the files they use online available, so you can download from many journals all the files that people use to do that paper, and then you can try to replicate it using a different outcome, or maybe apply it to the context of Indonesia. And that's also an easy strategy, but I think you should not take American Economic Review because it's probably too complicated. Because even myself, sometimes I try to look at that, but sometimes these files, even if they put the files, it's such a complicated thing. It takes so long to understand what is this, that in the end it's easier to redo my own, my own files, my own. Yes. So you have to find a more intermediary level journal in your area, and then inspire from that. If you have more questions, so what I will do next time, I'm going to give you some examples with only regressions. Some examples of some master students that used regressions. Okay, the only weight regressions, for example. Okay, thank you so much. Yes, so I will do this next time, yes, okay. So we'll do this next time together with or should I do this now? Okay, so, well, one important question, why people use differences in differences, okay, is that if you don't use some methods like this and that you don't find some exogenous variation, as I said before, everything is correlated. So another example is the case, for example, of private and public health. So do you have private health insurance in Indonesia? Yes? Okay. So imagine that we want to see if private health insurance makes you healthier. Okay? So we're going to compare people that have private health insurance and people that do not have private health insurance, and we're going to look at their health. Okay? What do you think that we're going to find? Probably we're going to find that people with private health insurance have better health. So can we conclude that the fact that you have private health insurance makes you healthier? No. We cannot conclude it because it is the people that have more money that are always healthier on average that can buy private health insurance. So we can deal with this private health insurance next time. I have some examples for private health insurance. Another example is the student loans. So I don't know if some of you can take student loans in Indonesia or not so much. No system for student loans. So in Europe and US, students can take student loans from the bank, and we can look at whether people that have student loans are doing has an impact on their studies performance or not. Again, this is tricky because very often, if you have a wealthier family, you don't need the student's loan. And if you have a wealthier family, maybe you have grown up with a specific set of your mind and cultural background. For you, it's going to be easier to study in the university, so you're going to have better results. So it is not because you did take a student loan or you did not take a student loan that you're going to do better in your study. So these issues are important when you want to look at some policies. Like you have to decide, do I give a grant to all the students so that everyone for sure has money to do their studies? Then some people will come and tell you, no, because if you give them so much money, they're going to be less good in their study because they're going to spend it to go out all the time. And then you have to find some strategy to really evaluate what is the efforts to give a student grants, but you cannot use the data on the people that have grants and those that do not have grants in the current system, because there are a lot of things that are correlated, because sometimes it's merit grants, so they are the best students, so you have to find your strategy. So you have to find a new policy and compare before and after the policy. And another thing you can do for your impact evaluation So another thing you can do for your impact evaluation is that you can compare with a different country. So sometimes people take, not Indonesia, but maybe you take a country that you think could be reasonably similar, like Malaysia, and then you compare, or to Singapore, I don't know, you have to find some neighboring country, and you can compare villages in Indonesia with villages in neighboring countries. Thank you so much for watching.
Interesting lecture, I think, and we're gonna have another lecture for the next week. Next week will be start at 4 p.m. Yeah, don't forget at 4 p.m. And we will move to Pertamina Tower because this room will be used by other activities. Okay, so I think that's all for today. Thank you for Elena, and please give a big applause again.